Okay, we can get started. Okay, so thank you for joining us today. I must say I'm very, very excited to host this first session of our new series, Ask Us Anything. As the name suggests, it's going to be a sort of live workshop during which you guys and ladies will get a chance to ask any ProtoPie questions you have and receive an answer from us live. Now, just a quick introduction before we dive into today's topic. My name is Patricia. I am an Italian girl living in South Korea and working as a customer success manager at ProtoPie. And with me today, I have Darren Bennett with love from the UK. Some of you might be familiar with Darren already. He's ProtoPie ambassador and trainer, as well as a product manager and at the British broadcast company Channel 4. For those of you who don't know him yet, Darren is a mastermind when it comes to creative interactive stuff in ProtoPie. So yeah, it's your lucky day. Today you'll be getting tips and best practices from a ProtoPie legend. Before giving you floor to Darren, just a very quick preview of what this session will cover. Darren will dive into how to get the most out of our integration with Figma. He'll share tips and best practices based on his experience of prototyping with Figma and ProtoPie. His presentation will be followed by a Q&A session during which we'll answer the questions you'll ask here live. And at the end, I'll briefly cover what is coming next and introduce our upcoming not to miss events. Okay, so let the fun begin. Darren, I'll let you share your screen and get started.
Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's slideshow. Okay, so yeah, so thanks for everybody for coming along to this webinar. A bit early for me, not an early riser, so try and get my brain into gear. So I'm just going to go through my experiences with my kind of Figma to ProtoPie workflow. Kind of keep it quite short because obviously we want to get to the questions. Yeah, I'm going to step through just kind of some different things that I do when I'm working with Figma and ProtoPie. Okay, so as you probably know, ProtoPie have created a plugin for Figma, so that's what you can see up on the left-hand side of the screen, and it's a pretty simple plugin. It's got just a few features, so you can effectively export scenes. Export frames to scenes in ProtoPie, and you can also export individual objects. It's also got a number of mappings. So by mappings, I mean certain layers in Figma map to certain features and functions and layers in ProtoPie, and we'll go through some of those as well. Okay. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is how you structure your Figma file for importing into ProtoPie. So these are some things I do. So I tend to try and think about my design in terms of interaction. So things I might want to be animating together or things that logically group together, and try and make sure that they're grouped in the Figma file. And I think that all of us as designers are in a very different mindset when we're designing to when we're doing interaction design. So when we're designing Figma. And I've seen some pretty messy Figma files in my time. And even, you know, it's in the heat of the moment, you're kind of designing stuff, and then you kind of bring it over into ProtoPie, and suddenly your layers are kind of all over the place, and it makes it a lot harder to optimize your time inside of ProtoPie. But you also want to not have to do that as a step in your process. Of course, you can do that. You can be really messy and then kind of reformat everything before you bring it in. But if you can kind of get into the process and into the habit of kind of organizing your layers in a certain way, then you're going to reduce the friction of flipping between Figma and ProtoPie. Okay, so think about interaction. Try and reduce the amount of nested frames that you use, because any frame is a layer, and that's another layer you'll bring into ProtoPie. And whilst ProtoPie is pretty good on performance from a layers perspective, it will just kind of add complexity. You know, it will kind of get in your way when you're trying to find certain layers, especially when you're adding interactions. I don't know about you, but I tend to use the search panel a lot in ProtoPie when I'm looking for a layer. And when you're searching, you're going to get that big long list of layers. So if you can reduce the nested frames to only the ones you need that are necessary, that's a good tip. Conversely, after you've imported from Figma into ProtoPie, you're probably going to have some layers that you don't need, especially if you're using, you know, Figma component libraries. You're going to have a lot of probably invisible layers, maybe for certain states of components that you don't need. So I tend to have a quick go through and I just delete anything that I don't need. And again, that just reduces the overall amount of layers that I've got in my file. Okay, a real bugbear of mine, this one, naming layers. It's really important to name layers anyway, but it's even more important to name layers when you're working in ProtoPie, because everything is driven by the name of layer, especially when you're adding triggers and responses. You're always targeting a particular layer. And there's effectively two ways you can select layers when you're adding interaction in ProtoPie. One is you can pre-select the layer before you add a trigger. That's going to pre-select the target. And then the other way is that you add a trigger and then you go searching for that layer. And again, if your layers are named like, you know, text layer 1, copy 2, and all those kind of things that kind of happen as you're designing, it's going to be very difficult for you to find the layer that you need. So please try and name your layers. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of naming layers is to remove the spaces between the words. And this is really applicable to when you're writing formulas in ProtoPie. For you guys that have worked with formulas, you'll know it's a very small window. It's a single line window. So you don't have a lot of space. So you want to try and keep your layer names as short as possible. And also removing space just makes them a bit more readable, a bit more human readable, especially when you're adding dots and brackets and all those kind of things. Now, I historically come from a little bit of a design coding background, so I've done a lot of coding in the past. So I've kind of got very much used to the camel case format, and we've got some formats over on the slide on the left here. So I tend to use camel case. I tend to use like the uppercase camel case. That's basically every time you start a new word, you add an uppercase to it, so it's readable and you're removing those spaces. But you can use hyphens if you prefer, or underscores. Any of those work. But do have a play around with it and see what kind of works for you. And I just get into the habit now when I name layers in Figma, I just kind of do it like this. The other part of naming layers, which can be quite useful, is thinking about the naming hierarchy. So this is very much similar to what we're doing a lot of in the design industry now, is thinking about kind of tokens and thinking about how we kind of present the intent and the style of a particular object in its name. For me, I keep it quite simple. So I'll normally lead with the component name. So I normally go for the most general thing to the most specific thing. So I'll start my name with button, and then I'll give it the name of the particular intent of that button. So if it's a next button, it's going to be button next. If I'm doing anything with styling, so I might have a light and dark mode, then I'd probably add dark to the end. But you know, you can, again, there's no kind of like hard or fast rules around this, but it's quite useful when you're, again, searching. So I might just search for button. I'll get all my button layers all in a list, and that's kind of easy to find things when I'm kind of choosing the layer for a target for a trigger. Okay, so back to the ProtoPie plugin. So as I said at the beginning, there's two main things you can do with the plugin. So it's super simple. You can either export a top level frame to which will become a scene in ProtoPie. So if you just put a frame down in Figma, that's a top level frame. And that's going to automatically map. And you'll see in the ProtoPie plugin, in the message area just below the logos, it's going to say export whatever as a scene. So you'll know you'll be exporting as a scene. So that what that means is it's going to take the frame and that's going to map to the scene. So the first frame is going to be removed effectively. If there's a color on that frame, that's going to become the background color of your scene. So you can get some really crazy results if you're trying to export an object and you forget to, and then it's actually a top level frame. It's going to come in as a scene. It's going to expand it all into the scene. Which brings me to the other way of exporting. So if you want to just export an object into an existing scene, then it needs to be wrapped in a top level frame. Okay. So that will force the plugin to see it as an object rather than a scene, and then that's going to bring it in, and it will bring in that kind of initial frame. So if you've got a background to the frame, so like my login button here, if I just wanted to bring that in, because it's already sitting inside a top level frame, it's just going to come in as an object. You do need to, when you're using the plugin, you do need to have ProtoPie running in the background. You do need to have a Pi file open. And depending on whether you're exporting a scene or an object, if you're exporting an object, you want to make sure you've got the correct scene kind of in focus in the Pi file in the background as well. Of course, you can move your export once you've exported it. I tend to export things sometimes just on a blank scene, like a pasteboard scene. So I can do, maybe if I need to do a little bit more prep work, I don't want to mess with my kind of main layers file, then I can do it that way. Okay, so the ProtoPie plugin does have the concept of reimporting. So we don't really have a 360 round trip capability. So you can't take your Figma files into ProtoPie, do some stuff, and then take them back to Figma, but we can kind of go one way. Excuse me. And it's actually pretty hard to break this reimporting. So, and I don't know the technical behind the scenes thing. I'm guessing it's using some sort of reference to the layer under the hood. So you can rename your layers. That's not going to affect the mapping. You can even change the position of layers. So the hierarchy doesn't really affect the mapping. Playing around with it yesterday, trying to break it. If you turn an imported layer or a group into a ProtoPie component, then that's going to break it. You're not going to be able to update that layer now. What will happen is it will just re-import like a fresh version of that layer because it will effectively ignore it. But if you're not doing that, if you're just kind of bringing your files in, you're bringing your layers in, bringing your designs in, and you've noticed something that doesn't import quite correctly, you can go back to Figma, you can make a change, you can just hit the export button again, and it's going to update the already exported layer inside of ProtoPie. You can even select an object inside that frame. So say, for example, I exported this sign up to layer, so this purple layer on the left-hand side, I brought it all in as a scene. And I've noticed that maybe there's a spelling mistake in one of the labels. I can just select that particular object, hit export, and it's going to update. I can also just select the whole scene, and it's going to update as well. So that can be quite useful just when you're kind of bringing your objects in. And I guess just kind of to talk towards that, to like how you actually bring things in. Obviously, when you look at tutorials and you look at kind of like stuff online, we always got like a beautiful design all ready to go. It's already organized, and we just bring the whole thing in. We might bring in like 3 or 4 scenes in. We know that that's not necessarily the way it happens in the real world. And I, for one, don't necessarily work like that. I will tend to bring objects in, and I'll organize them inside my ProtoPie file. So that's another way you can think of working. That's kind of more my pipeline. So it really depends on what you're designing and how finished it is. If you're working with a design system, everything's nice and neat, all your layers are nice and neat, then you'll probably be able to get away with just bringing it straight in. But I think it's just trying things out and seeing how it works for you. Okay, so this is a little bit of an issue. It's something that kind of trips a few of us up. So ProtoPie have got this amazing feature where you can import images from ProtoPie from Figma into ProtoPie. But there's a few bugs or a few nuances between the way Figma deals with images to the way ProtoPie is currently dealing with images. And one of them is when you bring an image into Figma, and most of us are probably going to be adding that as a fill to a frame. Obviously, you can bring it in as an object as well, but I tend to just add them as fills. And you can see here on the left-hand side, by default, your image is going to come in as a fill type. So there's a few different types, a few different ways you can position that image fill within Figma. If you leave it as fill and then your image boundary is not a square, so it works perfectly if it's a perfect square, but if it's a rectangle, either a portrait or landscape rectangle, and you bring that to ProtoPie, it's gonna stretch the image. Okay, so the mapping of what ProtoPie interprets fill is not the same as Figma. So luckily at the moment there's a hack of the way around this. If you set your image fill to crop in Figma, it's going to bring in the image correctly. It's not going to stretch it. So you can just do that in that instance. And hopefully the team will be looking into this at some point in the future. Okay, so another kind of thing that I've come across which can trip up the plugin is complex SVGs. And by complex, I mean something that's got more than one path in it. So you can see I've got this home icon on the left-hand side, and you can see the top one is fine. So basically you can see the door and you can see the outline of the roof, but it's the bottom one, you can see it's filled in. And that's because of the way Figma draws vector paths. Always, some of the apps draw vector paths. And it's got all to do, not that I'm super technical, but it's got all to do with the direction that the path has been drawn in. Luckily, we've got a great plugin called Fill Rule Editor in Figma, and that enables you, if you do bring in an SVG file, and you find that when you, and just to say, it only trips it up when you make the SVG editable in ProtoPie. So if you bring in the SVG and you don't touch it, it's going to be fine. But if you make it editable, and you'll be wanting to make it editable if you want to change the color of it, or you want to control the fill, sorry, the stroke of it, that's when you're going to see this kind of breakage. But if you do find that in a particular icon, just get this Fill Rule Editor plugin, and then you can change the direction of the internal path, and then you can fix it quite easily, and then you can bring it in. Okay, so just to kind of finish off, I've spent some time just kind of going through and writing out all the mappings. So feel free to screenshot this. Kind of touch on some of them. So as I said previously, top level frames in Figma map and export as scenes in ProtoPie. Nested frames export as container groups. So if you just want to bring it in a group, then you need to make sure you just wrap it in a frame. Frames and groups map to containers. So even though in Figma we have a differentiation between these two types of containers, so we have frames and we have groups, which is obviously a selection of scalable objects, ProtoPie doesn't have this distinction. So whether it's a group or whether it's a frame, it's still going to come in as a container when you bring it into ProtoPie. Text layers map to SVG text layers. So what that means is that when you bring in a regular text layer from Figma into ProtoPie, it's going to make it an SVG image. So it's not going to be editable text initially, but it's going to preserve the font, it's going to preserve the styling. So if you're going to share that prototype with somebody who doesn't have that font, it's going to render correctly. The caveat is if you, again, make that text layer editable, you will now be able to edit the text and therefore use formulas and do interactions on it. But you're not going to be able to preserve, not currently, you're not going to be able to preserve the font and the styling. I know this is something the ProtoPie team are working on, and it's definitely something that we've been asking for in the community. So hopefully this will change. But as of today, there's a bit of a, I guess, a pro and con, or you know, you want to make dynamic text, but you're not going to be able to preserve the styling. Now, from my own experience, I don't really see it as an issue. Most of the time when I'm figuring stuff out, or if I'm testing things, people are more focused on the way things work rather than how they look. Certainly from a usability testing perspective. So I wouldn't worry too much about it personally from that perspective. But obviously it'll be nice to be able to render out how prototypes correctly. Complex vector path. So anything that's a complex vector path is going to come in as an SVG layer. You can, of course, like I said before, make that editable, so you can control the fill. and some of the other and stroke and things like that, which you wouldn't get just by having an SVG layer. As we've seen, frame image fields map to container image fields, and there are a few different options you can do there, but they're not completely aligned right now. So just bear that in mind. ProtoPie doesn't have a line tool currently. So if you're drawing a line in Figma, it's going to come in again as an SVG layer. You can convert that again by making it editable, but you're going to get effectively a rectangular path. So it depends on what you want to do. I mean, sometimes I tend to replace those with just native ProtoPie rectangles. So obviously we've got a few native drawing objects inside of ProtoPie. But yeah, that's kind of where we are with that. Components. So it used to be that Figma components would break when they came into ProtoPie, but now they don't, which is great. So you don't have to, what we used to have to do is break apart components before bringing them into ProtoPie. Now we don't have to do that. So you can keep all of your components preserved. When you bring them into ProtoPie, they're not going to convert into ProtoPie components right now, but they are going to come in correctly, and they'll just come in as a container group, as any other kind of container. And of course, once you've got them into ProtoPie, you can turn them into components. And to be honest with you, I think it's a very different kind of, making components in ProtoPie is very different to making components in Figma. I'm not sure maybe some people would disagree with me, but I'm not sure I'd want them to convert into components automatically anyway. And I like to have control over that. You're doing a lot of different things when you're making ProtoPie components to what you're doing in Figma. So I don't really see that as a hang up. Layer constraints. So if you're going top left or scaling, those kind of things, they map a one-to-one mapping between the two tools. If you've got a layer turned off in Figma, that's going to also be turned off, but will still export into ProtoPie, which is good. And also some properties as well, like opacity is preserved between the two tools. One of the cool things I found out recently, actually, is there are some features within Figma prototyping mode which also map to ProtoPie. So for example, this is something I use quite a lot now. Obviously doing a lot of mobile apps, doing hell of a lot of scroll views going on. So if you go into prototype mode in Figma and you you've got a scrollable view in your design, you set it to scrollable, that's gonna, when you export it to ProtoPie, it's gonna come in as a scroll container, and it's gonna set the kind of bounding box, which makes it scrollable to the correct height. Obviously you set that in Figma. So you can do that in Figma if you want to, and then that's going to map over. Similarly, if you're adding any navigation noodles in prototyping mode in Figma, if you do happen to have a connection, like a navigation noodle going from one frame to another, and you export one of those scenes into ProtoPie, it's going to add a trigger. It's going to add a tap trigger, and it's going to add a jump response. That jump response is going to be empty because it doesn't know, because obviously you haven't got the other scene in ProtoPie at that point. But it does start to lay down some of the triggers and responses for you. And then finally on my list is the shadow effect. So effects in general in Figma are not like supported as editable in ProtoPie. They will come in as a kind of SVG layer or some sort of groups layer. But the one that does come in is the shadow effect. So we do have a shadow effect in ProtoPie, and that does map to the Figma shadow effect. It doesn't support multiple shadow effects in one kind of effect list. We've only got one in ProtoPie, and there are some ways kind of to mimic that in ProtoPie. But if you've just got like a single shadow, then that's gonna map over as well. Okay, so that's me done. That's yeah, kind of a little bit of a dive into how I use Figma and ProtoPie together and some of the things that I've kind of discovered over the years. Back over to Patricia.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Darren. It was super interesting. It's now Q&A time. So yeah, we try to keep this presentation short to have enough time to answer as many questions as possible. So please head over to the Q&A tab, which you'll find at the bottom of the Zoom window, and leave your questions there. I see we have a question that has to be answered. So Charles Lampos asked, so the best way is to export components from Figma. If you like to keep margins and then create from container group a new component in ProtoPie, Okay, Darren, will you take this one?
Best question is what I'm thinking. If you like to keep margins, etc., and then create a container group. So I'll try and answer that. Not sure I kind of understand the question completely, but if you bring so yeah, well, I guess there's two ways of doing it. It really depends on how you feel about it. So you can normally, if you've got your design kind of correct, like I always, when I create my designs in Figma, I use auto layout a lot. And I didn't really touch on auto layout in that presentation, but I will use auto layout margins and paddings to kind of organize my containers. So when they come into ProtoPie, they're going to have those kind of things already there. So again, because ProtoPie just brings in pretty seamlessly, brings in a frame and all of its contents into a container group, it's gonna have those patterns and margins. I guess the thing to point out here is that ProtoPie doesn't have auto layout right now, so it will respect the obviously the positioning of things, and the way ProtoPie positions things is relative to the container, not relative to the whole file. So it's going to lay things out correctly. One of the things actually that happens right now in terms of auto layout, which I'm sure will be fixed soon, and this is mainly because Figma changed it. Figma changed the direction of auto layout objects. So they used to have to be bottom up in the layers to kind of visually show top down. And then Figma changed that so that it was top down, but obviously the plugin was already working on the old way. So if you do bring a set of auto layout objects in, they're going to be reversed in the layers panel. They're not going to be reversed visually, but they're going to be reversed in the layers panel currently in ProtoPie. I don't know if that answers the question. Let me know.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question from Rachel. Can I use ProtoPie on a Raspberry Pi to control a Figma ProtoPie on a screen and a LED use case when the user clicks on a digital button on the screen and the LED will turn green? This is something that can be done with Connect. I don't know if Darren, you've already tested this specific interaction.
Played around a little bit, yeah. So you can, yeah. So there's so you can connect Pi files to Arduino, the Grove components, which is kind of a flavor of components you can get, probably the easiest ones to work with. So effectively, yes, you can do what you're asking to do through ProtoPie Connect.
Yep. Just to clarify, ProtoPie Connect is an extension hub that is available paid plans, so in the Pro or Enterprise plans. And yeah, that's the answer. Do you have any other questions? Okay.
It can be about anything. It doesn't have to be about the fix.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be related to this topic. Okay, I'm gonna answer a question someone left through Instagram. Someone asked if it's possible to export the files you make in ProtoPie to Figma and Adobe XD. So yeah, this is unfortunately not possible. You can of course import design files from Figma, Adobe XD, and Sketch into ProtoPie, but the other way around is not possible. Okay. Okay. This, we have 2 new questions. Okay, Natalia asks, trying to prototype a game like T-Rex Run. I know nothing about animation effect. How do you create the infinite loop animation? I'll let you answer this one, Darren.
Yeah, so it's probably quite similar to how you do a loop animation in After Effects. So the way you typically do like a run animation would be you'd be animating your character running, so basically the legs moving. And in After Effects, you'd probably do this in a pre-composition. In ProtoPie, you can do that in a component. And then within ProtoPie, you've got the ability to loop animation. So you can then loop that animation, or you could even control it by using some messages. And then you would take that component on screen, and then you would effectively animate it from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. So you've got your internal component doing the motion. I'm assuming like the running motions, the leg motion. I don't know what this is. This is legs. And then you're then animating that component instance across the screen, and that's similar to how you do it in most animation tools. To create the infinite loop animation, there's actually a setting. In fact, yeah, it might be worth just sharing my screen. Can I share my screen, Patricia?
Yeah, sure.
We just go into ProtoPie and let's create a new file. So let's just get an object. Okay, so let me just close the Q&A. So I've got my object here, so I can let's just add a start trigger to this, and you can see I'm going to add a. This is actually, let me do something a little bit more obvious. Let's get the star. It's probably the only thing I use the star for. So we're going to rotate the star. And we're just going to rotate it by 360 degrees. And you can see down here, there's a repeat function. Okay, so that's my looping function. So I'm going to repeat it and we'll check that on. And you can see that it gives me a count and it gives me an interval. Okay, so the count would be like a finite amount of times I want my object to run. And then the interval is the time between each kind of repeat. Okay, so if I want a continuous motion, I can actually use this option underneath. It's infinite repeats. That's kind of effectively gray out the count now, so it's going to run infinitely. And normally I'd want like a zero interval between the rotation. And then obviously you can choose your duration here. And then the other thing you probably want to do for continuous motion, you want to use a linear curve. So you don't want any easing in or easing out, because you're going to see that on the repeat. And as you can see, I've obviously need to also change the origin to be in the center, otherwise you get crazy things happening. And there you go. Now I've got a infinitely repeating animation. So that's how you do it.
Amazing, thank you. So we have another question from Handers. Any tips on collaborating on files with other designers and making sure they're easy for people to drop into?
Sorry, I didn't hear that one. I was busy doing things. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Okay. Any tips on collaborating on files with other designers and making sure they're easy for people to drop into?
I think it's a lot of it's trying to self-document. So make sure your prototypes are as self-documenting as possible. So that means, like, if you look at this shameless plug, if you look at this SkeletonUI, which is a component library that I've created for use for anybody, but have a look at the layers here. So, you know, again, it's naming layers, making sure everything is kind of like human readable, because again, like any file, even a Figma file, it's hard to find things. Obviously, it's much harder when you're dealing with interaction to find out what things do. So think about actions, you know, that make it clear about what something does. So I've got this message here that's going to show the dialogue, and this opacity is going to show the dialogue as an opacity. This tap button one is going to confirm the name, and then I've got this close function. So I'm trying to make it as human readable as possible. The other thing you can do is use variables. So sometimes you might be doing something just by using a value, and it won't be immediately clear what that value does. But if you write that value to a variable and then you're using a variable name, and that name could be, it's obviously going to be very descriptive, then that's a good way of just making things a bit more self-documenting. If you're using components, then you can also document inside of a component as well. So for example, in this component, you've got something called the component guide, which I'm not sure how many people actually know about. So I'm inside of a component. I've got this component guide, so I can edit this, and I can actually put descriptions of what the variables do that I use, what the messages do that I use. So obviously it is specific to variables and messages, but I can do a description of what this component is for. And that's accessible outside. So if I then click on a button here, I can go to this guide here, and it's going to give me all of this information for how my component works and all the kind of internal features. Does that answer your question? Hopefully.
Thank you. Okay, Joseph asks, Darren, would it be possible to show how the import from Figma to ProtoPie works through a screen share?
The plugin,
can quickly demonstrate
sure.
how it works.
Yeah, of course we can. Strangely, I had a file prepared just in case. Okay, so here's my design, beautifully labeled and organized. And I'm just going to get my ProtoPie plugin up. So here it is. So you can see here, so I've got a top level frame selected here, so you can see that it says export as one scene. So it just treats all top level frames as scenes. If I drill in and select an object inside, you can see now it says export one object to ProtoPie. Okay, so I'm just going to select that and hit export, and boom, that's in. You can see that my main container is content. So just going back to Figma, you can see that, remember, the top level frame gets removed when you're exporting as a scene. So now the content frame becomes the top level container inside of ProtoPie. And if I deselect everything, you'll see that my scene background has become the blue. So effectively that first frame has been converted into the scene itself. And then if we open it up, we can have a look and see how things have mapped. So obviously mostly this is kind of like rectangles and things, but you can see that all the frames are turned into containers. You can see that I've got a text layer here, which is turned into one of these SVG buttons I was talking about. So SVG layers I was talking about. And if I select that, if you look over here, you can see this is where the make editable button lives. So if I want to turn that text into real text, I can just hit that, and that's going to be now editable. You'll see the icon has changed. You can see I had an icon layer, which had opacity turned off, and that's mapped to the opacity being turned off inside of ProtoPie as well. So yeah, so a good mapping. If I want to make a change, so maybe I want to change the color to a different color, and I can just re-export that, and then that's just going to update the existing export. And similarly, if I want to change something specific, so like this text field, and just export that, again, that's going to update the existing text field as well. So that's some of the re-importing features.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so next question. Is direct design possible in ProtoPie? Yeah, the answer is yes. You can design directly in ProtoPie. However, ProtoPie is primarily a prototyping tool. So you wouldn't find all the features you can find in Figma, Adobe, XD, or Sketch. But yeah, it's we're working on adding new design features. So yeah, stay tuned and share your feature request.
Yeah, and I do design in ProtoPie. I'm one of the few people that do, because I really believe that designing for interaction is something we should be doing before we worry about the visual representation of things. And certainly if you're working on a new design and you want to kind of validate it, a lot of your design decisions will change once you've played around with the interaction side of things. So you can see here, I can bring in text labels. I can effectively white box or wireframe, if you want to call it that. I prefer white boxing, which is something they do in the games industry a hell of a lot when they're building stuff out. I tend to white box a lot in ProtoPie, figure stuff out, or even bring in individual, like I wouldn't necessarily have a kind of screen like this. I might have like lots of separate things kind of all hanging around, and I might just bring this in. Again, I can just kind of export that in, and then I might start mucking around with it like that. If I need things, especially around icons and things, I might just have some icons. So I'll be flipping between Figma and ProtoPie, bringing in icons, bringing in bits and bobs, and just kind of structuring it. And I mainly do that because this puts me in a different mindset. When I'm in ProtoPie, I'm thinking in a different way about my design to the way I think when I'm in Figma. And I've got complete control over starting to play around with interaction very, very quickly. So yeah, I definitely advocate that process actually.
Okay. Next question. Is it possible to import files into ProtoPie without using plugins? For instance, import SVG, Figma or sketch file formats on their own without the source app running? I'm afraid this is not possible. So in order to import a design file into ProtoPie, you would have to use the plugins or the legacy import. But in any case, importing SVG or a fig file directly, this is currently not possible. I don't know if you want to add anything, Darren.
What was I didn't quite hear the question.
No,
what was the question?
Sorry, was that? Is it possible to import files? Yeah.
Without using plugins? Yeah, yes, you can.
Yeah.
You can. So before we had the plugin, we used to import things in a different way. So for example, and even in Figma, like if I want to not use the plugin, for example, and maybe it's certain things. So what you're not going to get, you're not going to get the mapping of the layers, right? But if you've just got like a graphic, or actually there's another reason you might want to do this, because at the moment the ProtoPie plugin does, when it exports, it does turn every single layer in your Figma file into a mapped layer. Now, sometimes you want to bring in what I call UI furniture, so stuff that's there, which you're never going to interact with. And you don't really want necessarily 20 layers being taken up by that stuff, because it obviously makes your file more complex to look at. So one of the ways you can get around that, so say, for example, these two kind of text layers here, let's just call this something. Say I just want to bring those in like together. I didn't want access to them or anything. I can just basically, I can right click and I can copy as SVG here inside of Figma. And then I can just come over into ProtoPie and I can just paste that in. And it doesn't work. It should work. What's going on? Let me try that again. It's always great when things don't work. There we go. Now you can see here now, this is an image and it's one layer. So it's a way of compressing your UI down into a lot less layers. So there's definitely a use case for being able to do that. Of course, you can import via the media tab as well. So you can import images. So if you're doing stuff in Photoshop, you're doing stuff in Illustrator, and you've done an SVG, you can export an SVG, for example, in Illustrator. You can open that from the file system and bring that in. If you've got an image from Photoshop, you can bring that directly in from the file system. So yeah, there is definitely, and obviously here in the media file, you've got other media formats as well, which aren't Figma supported, like video, audio, and of course Lottie as well. You can bring in. So yeah, some different ways of bringing stuff into ProtoPie.
Thank you. Okay. Next question. A curious question: did the ProtoPie development team ever consider switching over to a web app? Okay, so this is not really in the roadmap for this year, nor early next year. It was discussed several times, but yeah, it's a big project. Which perhaps you wanted to elaborate, Fredo? on this one?
Oh, okay. ProtoPie is actually
where you
already a web app. Technically, ProtoPie is a web app. It's an Electron app, so that's why it runs on macOS and Windows. Yeah, like Patricia mentioned, we've thought about it, but it would be a pretty big task, and would require a lot of resources, meaning that we cannot work on other features. So right now we're prioritizing building other features. However, perhaps in the near future, we could still consider bringing ProtoPie Studio into the browser. So, yeah.
Thank you, Fredo. Okay, next question. Can we now use video files as overlay backgrounds or layers in our ProtoPie? Yes, absolutely. Perhaps, Darren, do you have a video to demonstrate this animation?
Darren, are you perhaps talking? You're muted. We can't hear you.
Oh, God. I have to do that all over again now. Yeah. Right. Yes, you can bring in video, as you saw silently. Let me just run through that again. Zoom doesn't tell me that I was speaking. So you import video from the file system. You can loop it automatically here. And that's going to run. You can also control it with triggers and responses. So I can have a tap trigger. So imagine this gray box is a button. And then I can add a playback response, select my video layer, and then pressing that button is now going to control it. And of course I can manipulate that. I can manipulate the video layer with all of the other responses as well. Oh, I've done that on the wrong thing. Video. Yeah, so you can obviously manipulate and transform the video like any other object in ProtoPie. So there you go.
Sorry. Sorry. Hello?
Darren, we have another question. So if you click on the Q&A function there on Zoom. Okay, so Julia is asking, is there a possibility in ProtoPie to convert Dropdown field imported from Figma into a real working Dropdown menu by adding list of options that the user can choose from while using ProtoType?
Yeah, totally. Because I built one in SkeletonUI. So there's a menu here. So I created this with Figma, bit of Figma and a bit of ProtoPie. So I've got an object here. Obviously, there's a bit of a bug at the moment in ProtoPie with text fields clipping, so that's why it's kind of clips out there. But yeah, you can effectively build this kind of component. This is built with components. It's using 2 components. You can see there's a lot going on, so it's not necessarily like super straightforward. I mean, it looks more than it is. There's a lot of kind of transforms and things going on. And of course, you don't necessarily have to build it the way I've built it. I've built it because I want to use it, have it as a reusable component. So there's probably some simpler ways of doing it. But if you want it reusable, then yeah, you can do that. And I should probably do a tutorial on that one.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Darren. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. I'm going to look at the chat box as well, just in case.
Oh, there's just one here from Sun. Hope ProtoPie would support importing Figma prototype works so that multi-scene edit would be easier. ProtoPie does support to an extent Figma prototypes. So you can bring in a Figma prototype into ProtoPie, and it will map certain things. So I guess the kind of highlight feature when this particular feature came out was Smart Animate. So ProtoPie does map to Figma's Smart Animate to an extent. So you can do that. You can effectively start a prototype in Figma if you want to, and then if you need to add something more advanced, you can bring it into ProtoPie and you can add that little kind of extra thing that you're looking to do. Although I wouldn't recommend it being like a common way of kind of prototyping. I think at the end of the day, you're probably going to be doing things differently in ProtoPie. If you're doing it natively in ProtoPie, you wouldn't necessarily. The models are slightly different. So the Figma prototyping model is different to the ProtoPie one. So whilst there is some synergy there, you're probably going to approach it differently, which is going to give you more options if you kind of start in ProtoPie. But yes, you do have that functionality if you need to quickly add something. So I hope that answers your question, Sun.
Thank you so much, Darren. Okay, so Tara Lampos is asking, or I guess it's more of a wish. Even think in the future to build design features to create a tool that is both the design and prototyping. And what about export to code? So regarding export to code, we do have the interaction recordings function, and I will share the link to the documentation from our documentation page. Yeah, so we do have interaction recordings, which is very useful for development handoff. And in terms of design and prototyping, yes, you can design in Adobe or Figma, export to ProtoPie, and then yeah, elevate your prototyping in Studio. So yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, just to add to that, like I said previously, like I design a lot in ProtoPie, but yeah, I think there's the risk of tools getting too bloated if they try and add all of the features. You can see it's in 3D tools. I mean, they're just like massive because there's so many things you can do in them. So I think there is a risk of doing that. I think the export to code part, I haven't really been in a situation where I've used tools that can export code that coders actually want to use that code. I know there are a few tools out there that do this kind of really well in some instances, mainly around kind of specific interactions. But they're normally tools that are targeting a specific platform, like iOS, for example. There's a tool that specifically exports code for iOS, and that's kind of what it's used for. But yeah, so that's a tricky one, just because of coders use frameworks and they have very different ways of organizing their code. to the extent of how useful code is. I'm not sure if anybody here on the call has had any experience with people using code directly from Figma, for example. I mean, I code CSS and I probably wouldn't use it. So yeah, not sure. It seems like this perfect thing that we want to happen. And maybe there will be a way of doing it, but I think at the moment it's a tricky one.
Okay. Okay, sorry. We're actually running out of time. So I guess we have time to answer one last question before wrapping up this session. Okay. So could you please summarize the main reasons for why designers should prototype in ProtoPie instead of Figma?
Well, I think the biggest reason is that Figma is not a prototyping tool. It's a drawing tool, and whilst it's got some prototyping capability, it's very rudimentary. It's very simplistic. Now, if you're doing a design that just needs very simplistic interaction, then yeah, you can get away with doing it in Figma. The other thing I kind of find really weird, and maybe it's just me, it's just the model of prototyping in Figma just feels very unintuitive. There's a lot of like using like a lot of frames and doing animation. Just doing a simple animation, like a looping animation, you have to use a lot of frames. And that feels a bit redundant to me. And I know there's reasons why Figma have done that. They want to make it very visual, and then that's great. But I think once you get into more complex interactions, you can get bogged down very quickly. ProtoPie is a tool that's designed to prototype. It's not a tool that's trying to give you the ability to draw and become this one tool that kind of rules them all. So it's very laser focused in being able to do that. And I think the key thing here is using the two tools together. And I think the more seamless ProtoPie can make the conversion or the pipeline between Figma and ProtoPie, it all will become very similar to, in a way, like going back to 3D tools, where you might have a lofting tool or you might have a motion tool. They all kind of exist like in the same tool, but they're effectively like sub tools. So it's not that it looks like they're in one tool, but they're not really. It's all about the connectivity. And I think obviously Adobe do this with their Creative Suite, where they make lots of connectivity between their tools. So yeah, I think that's probably the main reason, is to, again, as an interactive designer, as any product designer is an interaction designer, and I believe you should be designing their interaction at the beginning of your design rather than at the end. And ProtoPie gives you really there's not really anything you can't create. Certainly in the world of consumption apps in ProtoPie, not that I've found anyway. So that would be my reason.
Okay. Thank you, Darren. I'm just gonna go sharing my screen. Okay, so just a few things before we wrap up the session. We have a few more cool events coming up this month. In case you don't know, we added a Notion page to our website where you can check all the live events we host and register. Yeah, would you be so kind to share the link in the chat, Rebecca? So, our next event will go live tomorrow at 10 a.m. Central European Time, and we'll focus on some of our most popular advanced features, conditions, and variables. So yeah, we'll be sharing the registration link in the chat. And we have the next Ask Us Anything session planned for next Tuesday, same time. So next time we'll talk about conditions with our prototyper, Habas Sina. And yeah, if you haven't yet, we encourage you to join our social media channels and community spaces to keep up to date with our news and projects, and connect with other designers who use ProtoPie and of course our team. So yeah, it's now time to say goodbye. We hope you enjoyed the session. You will receive an email with a short survey. Please take it if you have 2 minutes. It will really help us make these sessions even more useful coming forward. So thank you so much for contributing to this first episode. We hope to see you again at the next event tomorrow or next week.